this place of honor where many of our dear Lanai veterans rest. Brothers like Don Dickensheet and so many more. We come today to honor our dear brother, Brian Murphy. Brian asked that we give a non-denominational service today, and he asked me if I'd speak just briefly about his life, some of the things he loved, and to tell you a little bit about his Vietnam experience. I think Vietnam was probably the center of his life in many, many ways, and in Hawaii. Well, Brother Brian Murphy grew up in the Bronx, New York. Some of you here know. He was a promising young student. He tells me he went through parochial schools. One of the things Brian Murphy told me he loved the most when he was a kid was running. Apparently he was a very fine runner. He liked to run track and field. He liked to run cross country. When Brian was in the hospital and he was very sick, he told me a lot about those days running. He told me a lot about endurance. Sometimes he'd call me up on the phone and he'd tell me, "John, I've got to sit up in a chair. They want me to sit in a chair for an hour to prove I can sit." And so for an hour he'd tell me about running races. He'd tell me about running against other kids. He'd tell me about how a lot of the other kids were faster than him, but over time Brian would keep going. Brian sometimes would win those races. It was something that he really, really loved. Brian was also a young man who was very intelligent. He loved the arts. He told me that he did pretty well in school in New York, and he had a scholarship. He could go to any college he'd like in the state of New York. He hadn't really decided what kind of arts that he wanted to study, but he knew he loved the arts. Well, the United States government called, and he was called into service. Brian Murphy went in the United States Army, went through basic training, served in several posts briefly. His dear brother Jim tells me that Brian taught close order drill at one point. Remember of a cadre?
He was cadre in Fort Chaffee, Arkansas.
Fort Chaffee, Arkansas. So Brian was doing close order drill and things like that. Well, they shipped him off to Vietnam. And once he got there, they sent him to Cam Ranh Bay. Cam Ranh Bay was a major port, and Brian was assigned to the 155th Transport Command. Well, it was a very hazardous job. Brother Brian was made a stevedore, but unlike a lot of things, he didn't get much training. He had his basic training. He knew his weapons. He knew his drill. He knew his customs and courtesies. But nobody taught him to operate cranes. Nobody taught him to operate forklifts. It was his brothers, the stevedores, that helped him learn the ropes. And Brother Brian Murphy tells me he never once, in that full year's tour of duty, saw a non-commissioned officer in the hold of a ship. I asked him what was wrong with them. He says, "I don't know, but they were back. They never went in the ships." I said, "So how did you learn to do all this stuff?" Well, it was the school of hard knocks. As so common with a soldier, they make the most from least. Well, Brother Brian Murphy worked 12 hours on, 12 hours off, 7 days a week. They unloaded ammunition from Liberty ships, the old ships used in World War II to bring supplies to Europe. Well, these Liberty ships were bringing 500-pound bombs, all kinds of ordnance, ammunition, weapons, and they were stored on pallets. And of course, they were stacked in with, blocked in with framing. So Brian just went in and got his hands dirty and started working. He tells me that he narrowly escaped death many times in those holes, because as those pallets are being lifted out, sometimes bombs would come loose. So he had to dodge those bombs, had to be pretty quick on his feet. Him and his brothers on those ships would back each other up every day. And Brian has told me that on several occasions his brothers were hauled out of there, either crushed or cut open. Some of those men he never saw again. He told me one particularly moving story. He went to an Air Force hospital at Cam Ranh Bay to see one of his buddies. his buddy had almost had his leg completely cut off from a large rotating saw. He said it took him about an hour to find his buddy. He walked through a hospital. There was almost no attendance there, and there were men in cots lined up, men in terrible situations. Finally, he found his buddy, sat down and talked to him, wished him the best, and he had to get back for duty. One of the things that really bothered Brian was he never saw that man again. Nobody ever told him what happened to that man. Vietnam was a cruel war in many ways. One of those ways was that the men really were not nurtured by some of their leaders, at least in Brian's organization. Brian learned self-sufficiency. He took care of himself. After the war, Brian has told me that he returned home to the Bronx, New York. Before the war, he had his eye on college. All sorts of things, the arts, family, all sorts of things. After the war was over, he told me things changed. He went home, stood in a few lines at the VA. He decided he didn't want anything to do with it. Him and some of his good brothers, like Jim Roby, decided we're going to Hawaii. That's what they did. They went to Hawaii. Brian told me we wanted freedom. We needed peace. And they found it here. They settled in Maui. They lived close to the land. They had life on their own terms. What can be more American than that? I know many things about Brian Murphy that I could share with you. All of you are his friends. I think the epitome of Brian Murphy might be summed up in two stories. One was the rescue of this man. Brian Murphy and his good brother John were on the beach in Maui. They were surfers. And they found another surfer, Brother Roddy, who'd had to punch a shark after the shark chomped on his leg. Well, Brian Murphy and his military background taught him what to do. And they helped this dear brother stay alive. He was extracted from the field, and he's walking today and serving the Lord. So that's one story from Brian Murphy, a guy who knew what he was doing. He could be relied on. He would back you up. I can say that about Brian Murphy. He was a quiet man. He liked to be alone, but he would back you up if you needed help. If you were hungry, he'd give you food. He was a fisherman, and he was a farmer. You know, the other thing that I know about Brian is he really loved animals. He had a chance to work at the animal shelter here on Lanai. And I visited with Brian about once a month. I travel here and fight veterans cases for him. Brian would tell me a lot about working with the cats. He told me a lot about what it meant to him. Those cats and Brian, really, they were the same. They could relate. They could understand each other. Those cats were his brothers and his sisters, as were the dear people who worked there. You know, I think Brian Murphy, he learned three things in the war. One, to be self-sufficient. Brian lived self-sufficiency all his life after Vietnam. He could take care of himself. Well, he learned a couple other things. He learned that peace was absolutely necessary in the world. And if you were to talk to Brian Murphy about the world and affairs, about society, about how we should treat each other, Brian Murphy would treat you with respect. He would treat you with the courtesy that he wanted to be treated with. I think that's a terribly important thing that he taught in his life. You know, I think that Brian Murphy, maybe I wrote it down, I can say it better than, if I look at it for a second here, you got to pardon me. Yeah. Brian Murphy saw the need of innocence. The cats are innocent beings. Nobody cared about them. Well, Brian cared. The veterans. How many people can tell you stories about veterans who've been forgotten? About veterans who, after they came back from the war, nobody really cared. Brian would help veterans, and I'll tell you one real and bona fide way he helped the veterans of Lanai, because this is an island where there's a lot of veterans, but they don't usually come in for help. Brian told me one day, he said, you know, he said, the state should start advertising. When you come to Lanai, you know, we used to put up placards, we'd put up little posters, and we'd get a few people coming in. He said, I want you to call up Alberta and ask her, can't you put a public service announcement in the paper for the veterans? I said, well, I don't have any money. I don't have any budget to do that. He said, well, I think she'll help you. I said, how do you know, brother? He says, well, she's a friend of mine. I said, okay. You know, a lot more veterans have been coming in the last year. We're trying to get them signed up for VA medical. We're hoping to get a lot better resources out here on Lanai. But you know, a lot of that is thanks to Brian having the guts to say, hey, let's do something about it. Brian was pretty active with another man who was buried here, Don Dickenchief, retired chief. Both of them were pretty much the activists on the island saying, yeah, we need more help for vets. I think that sums up Brian Murphy's life, you know, for me, from my experience. And, you know, I had a little time to spend with him when he was sick. And Brian is more interested in others than he was himself. He's more interested in telling me about others and concern for other people. I think that's the song of Brian Murphy's life, caring about other people. I wonder if anybody has something they'd like to say about Brian. If not, I want to call each of us to a time of silence, to have silent prayer as you are called in the freedom that you enjoy as Americans under the Constitution of the United States. No one can tell us what to think or believe, but you can choose your own way. I think that was Brian Murphy's way. He chose his own way. Let us remember our brother in silence.